Okay, so I'm a bit late to the party on this one. This was Politics Live, and this clip is about Nadine Ziara, and his tax affairs. And on the panel, they have Gareth Bacon from the Conservative, Chris Bryant from Labour, Abinia Akanona is a Conservative commentator, and Rosa Prince, the editor of the House magazine, which I've never read. I've never seen her before, but it is interesting what she has to say. Anyway, so the reason why I wanted to do this clip is because I just thought it was amazing on how the people on the Conservative side, the matrix bending that they need to do in order to normalize the fact that this guy is under investigation, that he threatened to sue both the tax expert and the reporter from the Times, and that he made a late payment to the HMRC where it appears that there was money due on £27 million that were paid to him. And what seems to be out there is the fact that it was set up in such a way that it didn't appear that the money was coming to him, which meant that he didn't have to pay the tax on the 27 million. But it just all really seems dodgy. And there's also the fact that if this happened whilst he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, then that would make him their boss. HMRC answers to him, and that would have been an interesting conversation. That they've come in to say, listen, you need to pay this amount of money. I don't even know if they approached him. I don't even know if it was approached him. It would have been from what I've seen is that the people from the guy, the tax expert and the Times reporter both passed this information on, which then stirred the pot, and then we are where we are now. But also what makes me laugh is that when things happen in the Conservatives, they seem to have this process where they ship out James Cleverly to come on Sky and Good Morning Britain and effectively sell his soul. And I was going to add a clip of both of the same Sky clip when he's on, when they're talking about Nadine Zahawi. He's very tense and he looks like he cannot string a sentence together. But then after, when they talk about foreign affairs, the eyes flowing. He's in his he's in his comfort zone, and it looks like two different people. But anyway, so they drag out James Cleverly before they have any type of defence, and so they have this guy who doesn't really know what to say, and all he can say is just nonsense. He can't answer any questions, and he doesn't want to slip up and get a bollocking when he goes back. So it just feels very tense, and you just he just wants to just move on to something else. And then after they've got a defence, and in this case, not so much that they have a defence, but in this case, the Prime Minister has referred him to the independent advice of ethics. And now when they bring people out, which in this case is Chris Phillips, they just hide behind the ethics, the investigation. There's nothing that we can say now because it's in the hands of, we'll have to wait for. And they do this all the time, kicking it down the can. it just appears that they're kicking it down the can for some other drama to happen, and then they can go through the same process again, and it just goes over and over again. But anyway, I got a bit carried away there. This clip is about 8 minutes long. Skip part of my ramblings and go straight to the clip, because it's again, it's quite insightful, and although I am a great fan of Chris Bryant, Rosa Prince just completely put it out there that, this kind of, like you just expect what we should expect, as opposed to just completely talking nonsense. And then there was something else. Oh, and this guy, Gareth Bacon, my God, the way he comes across is like, how dare you ask me these questions, and how dare you question the ethics of the Conservative Party and my peers. Anyway, I've rambled on way more than I expected, than I wanted to. Just take a look and let me know what you think.
Right, let's talk about Nadhim Zahawi, the Conservative Party chairman, who has been asked lots of questions about his tax affairs. He's determined to stay on. We now know that Nadhim Zahawi paid outstanding tax owed, plus a penalty. You can see here the BBC News story. Nadhim Zahawi, tax row Conservative Party chairman, determined to stay on. We also understand that the sort of ballpark figure of the entire settlement, we don't know for sure, is around £5 million, not insubstantial. And it happened at the time that he was briefly Chancellor last summer. Gareth, what's your view about this? Do you think Nadhim Zahawi can actually stay in post?
Well, I think, so if we get to the facts of the issue, I understand this is to do with founder shares that were granted to his father when Nadhim set up YouGov about 20 or so years ago. And of course, that company has grown exponentially, and Nadhim has a whole load of business interests. And I understand that questions were being asked when he was about to be appointed as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in common with many businesses, there was a dispute between his business and the HMRC about the level of tax owed, and he, rather than prolong it, paid what they demanded. And this is something that happens a lot with high net worth individuals, and happens with companies, that there is a dispute around these things and you come to negotiate a settlement.
Right.
In his case,
but he was someone who was going to be Chancellor, who was in charge, effectively, of HMRC.
Yes, but the point that needs to be made here is that Nadhim Zahawi is not an accountant. His company employs accountants, and they were advising him on his tax affairs. And so it wasn't, and HMRC's own language said that this was a careless omission. That's their language, not his. Rather than an attempt to evade tax, which of course would be illegal. Yes. And so
careless to the tune of, if the whole settlement was around £5 million. But so you think he should stay in post?
Well, that's not for me to say. I mean, that's very much.
You must have a view, Gareth. Do you think he should stay, or do you think now there's this ethics inquiry that's been launched, do you think he should be at least suspended, or at least no?
No.
Okay.
And the reason is because we live in a society where you are innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around.
Chris?
Well, I've got to be very careful, because as I understand it, I read in one of the newspapers today that there's been a complaint to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, as well as the investigation that I think you're talking about, which I presume means that Rishi Sunak has told the independent advisor on the Ministerial Code that he should investigate.
That's exactly right.
Now, if the Parliamentary Commissioner launches an investigation, that could theoretically come to my committee, which I chair, and so I can't hold a view.
OK, well, that's...
I mean, I've got a view broadly on transparency, and I think transparency is really important.
Well, I think most people would agree with that, wouldn't they?
Well, yes, but and probably the best way for that to be resolved is, of course, for Nadhim Zahawi to come on the programme and explain everything. But one of the things that really worries me, if you try to find out the full list of ministerial interests at the moment, the last time they were published was last May. The list of ministerial interests at the moment, available online, isn't even an accurate list of ministers. All right. It's a list of the government 3 ago.
All right. Well, do you think there's been enough transparency? Some of your colleagues have said not. We've heard at least 2 Conservative MPs saying he needs to get everything out there, and he should have done so.
Well, I mean, I think within hindsight, he probably would agree with that because it would have made the whole thing go away. But ministers are required to declare their ministerial interests, and the point Chris makes there, I think, is a reasonable one. The ministerial interest should be as up to date as members of Parliament's interests, and I would be inclined to agree with that.
I just want to, we're going to go to my colleague, our correspondent, in just a moment. But can Nadhim Zahawi still fulfil his role as party chairman while all of these questions are still swirling?
Yes, I think he can. I think Gareth is absolutely right to say that we do live in a society where people are innocent until proven guilty. And, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister has called in an investigation with the independent ethics advisor. And I think we'll have to reserve our judgment until that conclusion has been made. I know Nadhim has contributed a lot to CCHQ with data.
That's the Conservative Central Office.
And I think one of the big problems, though, for Rishi Sunak is undoubtedly Nadhim's main asset is that he's a great media performer. And he can't do that at the moment because all that's going to happen is good journalists like you will ask about his tax affairs.
Thank you. And Nadhim Zahawi, you can come on the programme at Chris's invitation any time to explain your tax affairs. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent. I'll come back to you in just a moment, Rosa, Nick Eardley. Listening to the discussion here, can he stay on, Nick?
Well, look, I think he wants to, Joe, and I think that by ordering this investigation, the Prime Minister has probably bought Nadhim Zahawi a bit time because, this morning there was just this deluge of further questions for the Tory chairman about how much he'd paid in penalty to HMRC, about how what has emerged now matched up with some of his previous comments. And I think there was a real question this morning about his future. If you have that investigation, though, it gives ministers that cover of saying, well, we need to see what happens with the investigation. Let's leave it to the independent advisor to go and look at that. So my hunch is that he probably does have a bit time just now. But there's also the possibility, I suppose, the more comes out. And if that keeps happening, it's more and more of an embarrassment for the Prime Minister. And it makes it harder and harder for him to justify keeping him in the job if he's going to keep talking about integrity and accountability.
Well, Nick, I'm going to show our guests and viewers a clip of Nadhim Zahawi in an interview on Sky News last summer when he was Chancellor. Let's have a listen.
I was being told that the Serious Fraud Office, that the National Crime Agency, that HMRC are looking into me. I'm not aware of this. I've always declared my taxes. I paid my taxes in the UK. I will answer any questions HMRC has of me.
Nick, is there any conflict between what he said there in that interview and what's happening now?
Well, look, I think that's probably in the eye of the beholder, to be honest with you, Joe. Some people might find it quite hard to square the idea that he's suggesting there that HMRC aren't looking at him at all. And what we know now is that when he was Chancellor, he did settle a dispute which included paying a penalty. We've not had an explanation of that from Team Zahawi this morning, but I get the impression that what he intends to do is basically ride this out, to say to the public, look, I've paid this because it was the right thing to do. I didn't challenge it because it would have complicated things, and ultimately I ended up paying the tax that I was due. But you're going to keep hearing accusations and criticism that it was too late, and that actually this just leaves a whole question mark over Mr Zahawi and over the government.
We're going to come back to you in just a moment. Rosa, what about the political capital being expended by Rishi Sunak over this?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very important point. I mean, there are two things. One is that Rishi Sunak came to office saying, I'm going to be a man of integrity. This is a complete change from what went before with Boris Johnson's government. The other thing is this perception that he's a bit out of touch. He's a multimillionaire himself. He has people around him who are very wealthy. At a time of a cost of living crisis, can he afford to have someone there in this important role who says, oh, I forgot to pay my $5 million. I've done it now, no problem. I think actually the answer to that question is people like Gareth, and whether Conservative MPs are going to be coming to the Prime Minister and saying, we can't campaign with this guy in situ. We're having our constituents coming up to us and saying, you guys don't understand what we're going through. And I think if people like Gareth and other backbenchers begin to do that, then I think Nadhim Zahawi is in more trouble than actually the findings of these various investigations.
Gareth?
Well, I mean, I'm not a high net worth individual, so these things are not something that I have to worry about personally on a daily basis.
No, but can you imagine constituents saying, you are out of touch, your party is out of touch?
Well, I can understand that they might say that, given the media coverage that we've had, but this is precisely why it's been referred to the Prime Minister's advisor or ministerial interests. And as I said earlier on, I'll repeat the point that I made. We live in a country where you're innocent until proven guilty. This is going to be investigated. As I understand it, there was a discussion with HMRC and he paid what they asked for. He didn't sit and haggle over it or push back on it. He just paid it.
How do we know that?
And I also repeat the point.
No,
I haven't spoken to him. I also repeat the point that Nadhim Zahawi, it would have been his accountants that were doing his tax returns over the last 20 years, not him himself. So if there's an omission, it's probably his accountants that have made it.
I think you're responsible for your own tax returns, though, aren't you?
Ultimately,
and I go back to what HMRC said, their language, it was a careless oversight rather than a deliberate evasion.
Careless can take in a sort of feeling of negligence. That's their term. Careless is the term that they use. But as you say, over £5 million, people might just find that difficult to believe, accountants or not. Let's just go back to my colleague Nick Eardley. Nick, have you heard from the lobby, the briefing that's given to political journalists in Westminster?
Yes, it's just over. It's where we get to ask number 10 some more detailed questions. And my colleague who's there is saying that number 10 is saying the Prime Minister didn't know about that penalty that Nadhim Zahawi got in his tax bill until this weekend. You might remember that when we were on the programme on Wednesday, just after Prime Minister's questions, there were some eyebrows raised when Rishi Sunak said that all of the questions asked of Nadhim Zahawi had been answered in full. Those eyebrows were raised because we'd asked questions that we hadn't got answers to. Well, we've just been told by the PM's official spokesman that he didn't know about this until the weekend, the penalty until the weekend when it emerged in reports. So we didn't have a full picture at Prime Minister's questions last week.
Right. I mean, no doubt there'll be endless questions about whether Rishi Sunak still has confidence in his party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi. I don't know whether there was a question or an answer at lobby, Nick.
Yeah, there was. He retains the confidence of Rishi Sunak, which I think means he still has the confidence of the Prime Minister. But I suppose it's now for whatever the independent advisor comes out with.
All right, let's talk about the other issue that is controversial for the government, and that is involving the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, and a sort of a meeting that he helped set up for Boris Johnson with a distant relative to give him some sort of loan guarantee when he was Prime Minister. But it was shortly before Richard Sharp was appointed, it's a political appointment, to be BBC chairman. What's the latest?
Well, look, I mean, the latest on that is that Rishi Sunak's government is basically saying it wasn't us, that when this all happened, it was under Boris Johnson. They think that the rules were followed properly, that Mr Sharp got the job because he was the best person for the job. And Richard Sharp has emailed BBC staff this morning setting out his version of events, which is basically that, yes, he suggested this potential link to the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, but then flagged up that he was applying for the BBC chairman job and was told, yes, you can't have any more involvement in the process or talk to Boris Johnson about this. But the opposition parties are still knocking on the door with this one, saying there needs to be a full investigation into how it happened, how exactly Boris Johnson went about that process. The BBC has launched its own investigation into whether there was a conflict of interest in Mr Sharp applying for the job and also being involved in linking up Mr Johnson with his billionaire cousin. That one, I think, still has a way to play as well.
All right, Nick Eardley, thank you. Do you support the idea of an investigation, Gareth, into this?
I'll be quite honest, I didn't know I was going to ask about this until just before I came on, so I don't know enough about it. So my understanding of this is that Mr Sharp referred Boris Johnson to, I think, his own relative, a very distant relative, who might be able to act as a guarantor for a loan, and that he had no further involvement in it.
That's certainly what he says, yes.
Well, indeed, and there's no reason to disbelieve him at this stage.
No. So do you think an investigation is needed or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we'll find out what the BBC discover when they look into it. I don't know where we are in terms of any potential investigation in Parliament, but I'm sure that will shed more light on the matter.
I mean, there is an issue, as Rosa said, Albie, with the mantra from Rishi Sunak about integrity, professionalism and accountability. Do you think this yet puts more pressure on Rishi Sunak? To some extent, these are issues that predate him in Boris Johnson's time. But all the same, he's the Prime Minister now.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. The stories that we're talking about today will not be the stories that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, wants us to be focusing on, or maybe indeed that the public want us to be focusing on. I sort of get the sense that maybe some of these stories are a bit exciting to us in the Westminster bubble, but actually perhaps viewers at home and people in the public will want us to be focusing on the cost of living crisis.
That's just shabby.
The NHS crisis.
Shabby, shabby, shabby.
Well, I mean, is it shabby? I mean,
Yeah,
just
it
a
is,
point.
because in the end, all of these things end up being excuses for bad behaviour. Whether it's, whether or not you wear a seatbelt, whether it's...
well, let's just show that, because
Dominic
you
Raab.
got very exercised about that in The Guardian. Rishi Sunak fined for not wearing seatbelt during Lancashire visit. This was last week. He was filmed in the back of the car. He was filming himself, I think, without a seatbelt. But actually, interestingly, Dominic Lawson
Yes, he doesn't like
has written in the Daily Mail... Well, I don't know if he doesn't like you, but he certainly doesn't in this column. The Prime Minister has far more integrity than his seatbelt critic, Cardinal of Kent, Chris Bryant. Are you in danger of being a bit too pious over these things by trying to lump them together?
Well, no, I think I'm chair of the Committee on Standards. I think it's important that we have standards in public life. I don't ever claim to be a pure, perfect, wonderful person, as you perfectly well know, and I've said that many, many times in Parliament.
Right.
But I just want to make it clear that when you have a government which repeatedly excused Partygate, and you end up with a Prime Minister, two Prime Ministers now, not quite in a row, because we had another one in the middle, who being fined by the police for different things. When you have the Deputy Prime Minister being investigated by the ethics for bullying on, I think, 4 different counts. When you have... I think Nadhim Zahawi has also been accused of not telling the full truth about the Greensill inquiry.
Because Dominic Lawson is saying that you are being far too pious, that there isn't a moral equivalence between not wearing a seatbelt. It is his claim, as some of the other things.
I haven't ever said that.
But Gareth, you wanted
I'm
to...
assuming then that Chris will be calling for Keir Starmer to be given a fixed penalty notice, because we saw over the weekend pictures of him sitting in the back of taxis giving interviews without wearing a seatbelt.
I think in 1996.
After the seatbelt law was passed. So, these things can go round and round and round, and we can blow as much smoke as we like to try to create the impression of impropriety. But actually, I think toning it down, this is a Westminster bubble thing. I really do think we should tone this down.
Is it a Westminster bubble thing, or is it more, it has credibility far beyond Westminster?
Personally, I think that the people who make the laws shouldn't break the laws. And I think that probably the average Joe in the street broadly agrees with that. I mean, I wear my seatbelt. It's not that hard. I pay my taxes. This is what we expect of citizens, and therefore, to the power of 10, we expect that of our politicians.
All right, let's talk about
Gareth, by the way, you say that you're in favour of ministers publishing things at the same time. Why did you vote against that in the House of Commons only a few weeks ago, then?
Look, I mean, the statement...
Because the whip's told you.
Well, hang on, let him answer.
The statement you just made about the minister's things not being published or up till May was something I was unaware of at this point. And I happen to agree with Chris.
Should you have been aware of it?
Well, I think that ministers' declarations should be in line with members of Parliament. I think that's a reasonable point. I think they should be in terms of when they are published.
We literally had a vote on it in Parliament, and you voted the other way.
All right, we're going to move on, because I want to talk about the ultra...
I think that last clip there completely sums up the Tory pie. That this Gareth Bacon says, no, I think that ministers' declarations should be in line with Parliament, and Chris Bryant points out that we had a vote for it, and you quite literally voted against it. But you say, but it's said in such a way that yes, this is what should happen, and it's just like the NHS. They underfund it and then complain that it's not working. Yeah, that's the Tories. But anyway, let me know what you think. Sorry, it's been a bit of a long clip, but I just needed to get some stuff off my chest.